Chapter 5 of The Iron Heel by Jack London. The Philomaths. Ernest was often at the house. Nor was it my father merely, nor the controversial dinners that drew him there. Even at that time I flattered myself that I played some part in causing his visits, and it was not long before I learned the correctness of my surmise. For never was there such a lover as Ernest Everhard. His gaze and his hand-clasp grew firmer and steadier, if that were possible. And the question that had grown from the first in his eyes grew only the more imperative. My impression of him the first time I saw him had been unfavorable. Then I had found myself attracted toward him. Next came my repulsion, when he so savagely attacked my class and me. After that, as I saw that he had not maligned my class and that the harsh and bitter things he said about it were justified, I had drawn closer to him again. He became my oracle. For me, he tore the sham from the face of society and gave me glimpses of reality that were as unpleasant as they were undeniably true. As I have said, there was never such a lover as he. No girl could live in a university town till she was 24 and not have love experiences. I had been made love to by beardless sophomores and gray professors, and by the athletes and the football giants, but not one of them made love to me as Ernest did. His arms were around me before I knew. His lips were on mine before I could protest or resist. Before his earnestness, conventional maiden dignity was ridiculous. He swept me off my feet by the splendid, invincible rush of him. He did not propose. He put his arms around me and kissed me and took it for granted that we should be married. There was no discussion about it. The only discussion, and that arose afterward, was when we should be married. It was unprecedented. It was unreal. Yet, in accordance with Ernest's test of truth, it worked. I trusted my life to it, and fortunate was the trust. Yet during those first days of our love, fear of the future came often to me when I thought of the violence and impetuosity of his love-making. Yet such fears were groundless. No woman was ever blessed with a gentler, tenderer husband. This gentleness and violence on his part was a curious blend similar to the one in his carriage of awkwardness and ease. That slight awkwardness. He never got over it, and it was delicious. His behavior in our drawing room reminded me of a careful bull in a china shop. Note: in those days it was still the custom to fill the living room with bric-a-brac. They had not discovered simplicity of living. Such rooms were museums, entailing endless labor to keep clean. The dust demon was the lord of the household. There were a myriad devices for catching dust, and only a few devices for getting rid of it. It was at this time that vanished my last doubt of the completeness of my love for him, a subconscious doubt at most. It was at the Philomath Club, a wonderful night of battle, wherein Ernest bearded the masters in their lair. Now the Philomath Club was the most select on the Pacific coast. It was the creation of Miss Brentwood, an enormously wealthy old maid, and it was her husband, and family, and toy. Its members were the wealthiest in the community and the strongest-minded of the wealthy, with, of course, a sprinkling of scholars to give it intellectual tone. The Philomath had no clubhouse. It was not that kind of a club. Once a month its members gathered at some one of their private houses to listen to a lecture. The lectures were usually, though not always, hired. If a chemist in New York made a new discovery in, say, radium, all his expenses across the continent were paid, and as well he received a princely fee for his time. The same with a returning explorer from the polar regions, or the latest literary or artistic success. No visitors were allowed, while it was the Philomath's policy to permit none of its discussions to get into the papers. Thus great statesmen, and there had been such occasions, were able fully to speak their minds. I spread before me a wrinkled letter, written to me by Ernest 20 years ago, and from it I copy the following. Your father is a member of the Philomath, so you are able to come. Therefore, come next Tuesday night. I promise you that you will have the time of your life. In your recent encounters, you failed to shake the masters. If you come, I'll shake them for you. I'll make them snarl like wolves. You merely question their morality. When their morality is questioned, they grow only the more complacent and superior. But I shall menace their money bags. That will shake them to the roots of their primitive natures. If you can come, you will see the caveman, in evening dress, snarling and snapping over a bone. I promise you a great caterwauling and an illuminating insight into the nature of the beast. They've invited me in order to tear me to pieces. This is the idea of Miss Brentwood. She clumsily hinted as much when she invited me. She's given them that kind of fun before. They delight in getting trustful-souled, gentle reformers before them. Miss Brentwood thinks I am as mild as a kitten and as good-natured and stolid as the family cow. I'll not deny that I helped to give her that impression. She was very tentative at first until she divined my harmlessness. I am to receive a handsome fee, $250, as befits the man who, though a radical, once ran for governor. Also, I am to wear evening dress. This is compulsory. I never was so apparelled in my life. I suppose I'll have to hire one somewhere. But I'd do more than that to get a chance at the Philomaths. Of all places, the club gathered that night at the Pertonwaithe house. Extra chairs had been brought into the great drawing-room, and in all there must have been 200 Philomaths that sat down to hear Ernest. They were truly lords of society. I amused myself with running over in my mind the sum of the fortunes represented, and it ran well into the hundreds of millions. And the possessors were not of the idle rich. They were men of affairs, who took most active parts in industrial and political life. We were all seated when Miss Brentwood brought Ernest in. They moved at once to the head of the room from where he was to speak. He was in evening dress, and, what of his broad shoulders and kingly head, he looked magnificent. And then there was that faint and unmistakable touch of awkwardness in his movements. I almost think I could have loved him for that alone. And as I looked at him, I was aware of a great joy. I felt again the pulse of his palm on mine, the touch of his lips. And such pride was mine that I felt I must rise up and cry out to the assembled company, "He is mine. He has held me in his arms, and I, mere I, have filled that mind of his to the exclusion of all his multitudinous and kingly thoughts." At the head of the room, Miss Brentwood introduced him to Colonel Van Gilbert, and I knew that the latter was to preside. Colonel Van Gilbert was a great corporation lawyer. In addition, he was immensely wealthy. The smallest fee he would deign to notice was $100,000. He was a master of law. The law was a puppet with which he played. He molded it like clay, twisted and distorted it like a Chinese puzzle into any design he chose. In appearance and rhetoric he was old-fashioned, but in imagination and knowledge and resource he was as young as the latest statute. His first prominence had come when he broke the Shardwell will. His fee for this one act was $500,000. From then on he had risen like a rocket. He was often called the greatest lawyer in the country, corporation lawyer, of course, and no classification of the three greatest lawyers in the United States could have excluded him. Note: this breaking of wills was a peculiar feature of the period. With the accumulation of vast fortunes, the problem of disposing of these fortunes after death was a vexing one to the accumulators. Will-making and will-breaking became complementary trades like armor-making and gun-making. The shrewdest will-making lawyers were called in to make wills that could not be broken. But these wills were always broken, and very often by the very lawyers that had drawn them up. Nevertheless, the delusion persisted in the wealthy class that an absolutely unbreakable will could be cast, and so, through the generations, clients and lawyers pursued the illusion. It was a pursuit like unto that of the universal solvent of the medieval alchemists. He arose and began, in a few well-chosen phrases that carried an undertone of faint irony, to introduce Ernest. Colonel Van Gilbert was subtly facetious in his introduction of the social reformer and member of the working class, and the audience smiled. It made me angry, and I glanced at Ernest. The sight of him made me doubly angry. He did not seem to resent the delicate slurs. Worse than that, he did not seem to be aware of them. There he sat, gentle and stolid and somnolent. He really looked stupid, and for a moment the thought rose in my mind, what if he were overawed by this imposing array of power and brains? Then I smiled. He couldn't fool me, but he fooled the others, just as he had fooled Miss Brentwood. She occupied a chair right up to the front, and several times she turned her head toward one or another of her confrères and smiled her appreciation of the remarks. Colonel Van Gilbert done, Ernest arose and began to speak. He began in a low voice, haltingly and modestly, and with an air of evident embarrassment. He spoke of his birth in the working class, and of the sordidness and wretchedness of his environment, where flesh and spirit were alike starved and tormented. He described his ambitions and ideals, and his conception of the paradise wherein lived the people of the upper classes. As he said, "Up above me, I knew, were unselfishness of the spirit, clean and noble thinking, keen intellectual living. I knew all this because I read seaside library novels, in which, with the exception of the villains and adventuresses, all men and women thought beautiful thoughts, spoke a beautiful tongue, and performed glorious deeds. In short, as I accepted the rising of the sun, I accepted that up above me with all that was fine and noble and gracious, all that gave decency and dignity to life, all that made life worth living, and that remunerated one for his travail and misery. Note: Seaside Library, a curious and amazing literature that served to make the working class utterly misapprehend the nature of the leisure class. He went on and traced his life in the mills, the learning of the horseshoeing trade, and his meeting with the socialists. Among them, he said, he had found keen intellects and brilliant wits, ministers of the gospel who had been broken because their Christianity was too wide for any congregation of mammon worshippers, and professors who had been broken on the wheel of university subservience to the ruling class. The socialists were revolutionists, he said, struggling to overthrow the irrational society of the present and out of the material to build the rational society of the future. Much more, he said, that would take too long to write, but I shall never forget how he described the life among the revolutionists. All halting utterance vanished. His voice grew strong and confident, and it glowed as he glowed, and as the thoughts glowed that poured out from him. He said, "Amongst the revolutionists I found, also, warm faith in the human, ardent idealism, sweetnesses of unselfishness, renunciation, and martyrdom, all the splendid, stinging things of the spirit. Here life was clean, noble, and alive. I was in touch with great souls who exalted flesh and spirit over dollars and cents, and to whom the thin wail of the starved slum child meant more than all the pomp and circumstance of commercial expansion and world empire. All about me were nobleness of purpose and heroism of effort, and my days and nights were sunshine and starshine, all fire and dew, with before my eyes, ever burning and blazing, the Holy Grail, Christ's own Grail, the warm human long-suffering and maltreated, but to be rescued and saved at the last." As before I had seen him transfigured, so now he stood transfigured before me. His brows were bright with the divine that was in him, and brighter yet shone his eyes from the midst of the radiance that seemed to envelop him as a mantle. But the others did not see this radiance, and I assumed that it was due to the tears of joy and love that dimmed my vision. At any rate, Mr. Wickson, who sat behind me, was unaffected, for I heard him sneer aloud, "Utopian." Note: The people of that age were phrase slaves. The abjectness of their servitude is incomprehensible to us. There was a magic in words greater than the conjurer's art. So befuddled and chaotic were their minds that the utterance of a single word could negative the generalizations of a lifetime of serious research and thought. Such a word was the adjective utopian. The mere utterance of it could damn any scheme, no matter how sanely conceived, of economic amelioration or regeneration. Vast populations grew frenzied over such phrases as "an honest dollar" and "a full dinner pail." The coinage of such phrases was considered strokes of genius. Ernest went on to his rise in society till at last he came in touch with members of the upper classes and rubbed shoulders with the men who sat in the high places. Then came his disillusionment, and this disillusionment he described in terms that did not flatter his audience. He was surprised at the commonness of the clay. Life proved not to be fine and gracious. He was appalled by the selfishness he encountered, and what had surprised him even more than that was the absence of intellectual life. Fresh from his revolutionists, he was shocked by the intellectual stupidity of the master class. And then, in spite of their magnificent churches and well-paid preachers, he had found the masters, men and women, grossly material. It was true that they prattled sweet little ideals and dear little moralities, but in spite of their prattle, the dominant key of the life they lived was materialistic. And they were without real morality. For instance, that which Christ had preached, but which was no longer preached. "I met men," he said, "who invoked the name of the Prince of Peace in their diatribes against war, and who put rifles in the hands of Pinkertons with which to shoot down strikers in their own factories. I met men incoherent with indignation at the brutality of prize-fighting, and who, at the same time, were parties to the adulteration of food that killed each year more babes than even red-handed Herod had killed." Note: the Pinkertons. Originally, they were private detectives, but they quickly became hired fighting men of the capitalists and ultimately developed into the mercenaries of the oligarchy. This delicate, aristocratic-featured gentleman was a dummy director and a tool of corporations that secretly robbed widows and orphans. This gentleman, who collected fine editions and was a patron of literature, paid blackmail to a heavy-jowled, black-browed boss of the municipal machine. This editor, who published patent medicine advertisements, called me a scoundrelly demagogue because I dared him to print in his paper the truth about patent medicines. Note, patent medicines were patent lies, but like the charms and indulgences of the Middle Ages, they deceived the people. The only difference lay in that the patent medicines were more harmful and more costly. This man, talking soberly and earnestly about the beauties of idealism and the goodness of God, had just betrayed his comrades in a business deal. This man, a pillar of the church and heavy contributor to foreign missions, worked his shopgirls 10 hours a day on a starvation wage and thereby directly encouraged prostitution. This man, who endowed chairs in universities and erected magnificent chapels, perjured himself in courts of law over dollars and cents. This railroad magnate broke his word as a citizen, as a gentleman, and as a Christian when he granted a secret rebate, and he granted many secret rebates. This senator was the tool and the slave, the little puppet, of a brutal, uneducated machine boss. So was this governor and this Supreme Court judge, and all three rode on railroad passes. And also this sleek capitalist owned the machine boss, and the railroads that issued the passes. Note: even as late as 1912 AD, the great mass of the people still persisted in the belief that they ruled the country by virtue of their ballots. In reality, the country was ruled by what were called political machines. At first, the machine bosses charged the master capitalists extortionate tolls for legislation, but in a short time the master capitalists found it cheaper to own the political machines themselves and to hire the machine bosses. And so it was, instead of in paradise, that I found myself in the arid desert of commercialism. I found nothing but stupidity, except for business. I found none clean, noble, and alive, though I found many who were alive with rottenness. What I did find was monstrous selfishness and heartlessness, and a gross, gluttonous, practiced, and practical materialism. Much more Ernest told them of themselves and of his disillusionment. Intellectually they had bored him. Morally and spiritually they had sickened him, so that he was glad to go back to his revolutionists who were clean, noble, and alive, and all that the capitalists were not. "And now," he said, "let me tell you about that revolution." But first I must say that his terrible diatribe had not touched them. I looked about me at their faces and saw that they remained complacently superior to what he had charged, and I remembered what he had told me, that no indictment of their morality could shake them. However, I could see that the boldness of his language had affected Miss Brentwood. She was looking worried and apprehensive. Ernest began by describing the army of revolution, and as he gave the figures of its strength, the votes cast in the various countries, the assemblage began to grow restless. Concern showed in their faces, and I noticed a tightening of lips. At last the gauge of battle had been thrown down. He described the international organization of the socialists that united the 1.5 million in the United States with the 23 millions and a half in the rest of the world. "Such an army of revolution," he said, 25 million strong, is a thing to make rulers and ruling classes pause and consider. The cry of this army is, 'No quarter! We want all that you possess. We will be content with nothing less than all that you possess. We want in our hands the reins of power and the destiny of mankind. Here are our hands. They are strong hands. We are going to take your governments, your palaces, and all your purpled ease away from you. And in that day you shall work for your bread even as the peasant in the field or the starved and runty clerk in your metropolises. Here are our hands. They are strong hands.' And as he spoke, he extended from his splendid shoulders his two great arms, and the horseshoer's hands were clutching the air like eagle's talons. He was the spirit of regnant labor as he stood there, his hands outreaching to rend and crush his audience. I was aware of a faintly perceptible shrinking on the part of the listeners before this figure of revolution, concrete, potential, and menacing. That is, the women shrank, and fear was in their faces. Not so with the men. They were of the active rich and not the idle, and they were fighters. A low, throaty rumble arose, lingered on the air a moment, and ceased. It was the forerunner of the snarl, and I was to hear it many times that night, the token of the brute in man, the earnest of his primitive passions. And they were unconscious that they had made this sound. It was the growl of the pack, mouthed by the pack and mouthed in all unconsciousness. And in that moment, as I saw the harshness form in their faces and saw the fight light flashing in their eyes, I realized that not easily would they let their lordship of the world be wrested from them. Ernest proceeded with his attack. He accounted for the existence of the 1.5 million of revolutionists in the United States by charging the capitalist class with having mismanaged society. He sketched the economic condition of the caveman and of the savage peoples of today, pointing out that they possessed neither tools nor machines, and possessed only a natural efficiency of one in producing power. Then he traced the development of machinery and social organization, so that today the producing power of civilized man was 1,000 times greater than that of the savage. 5 men, he said, can produce bread for 1,000. 1 man can produce cotton cloth for 250 people, woolens for 300, and boots and shoes for 1,000. One would conclude from this that under a capable management of society, modern civilized man would be a great deal better off than the caveman. But is he? Let us see. In the United States today, there are 15 million people living in poverty, and by poverty is meant that condition in life in which, through lack of food and adequate shelter, the mere standard of working efficiency cannot be maintained. In the United States today, in spite of all your so-called labor legislation, there are 3 million of child laborers. In 12 years, their numbers have been doubled. And in passing, I will ask you managers of society why you did not make public the census figures of 1910. And I will answer for you that you were afraid. The figures of misery would have precipitated the revolution that even now is gathering. Note: Robert Hunter, in 1906, in a book entitled Poverty, pointed out that at that time there were 10 millions in the United States living in poverty. Note: in the United States Census of 1900, the last census the figures of which were made public, the number of child laborers was placed at 1,752,187. But to return to my indictment, if modern man's producing power is 1,000 times greater than that of the caveman, why then, in the United States today, are there 15 million people who are not properly sheltered and properly fed? Why, then, in the United States today, are there 3 million child laborers? It is a true indictment. The capitalist class has mismanaged. In face of the facts that modern man lives more wretchedly than the caveman, and that his producing power is 1,000 times greater than that of the caveman, no other conclusion is possible than that the capitalist class has mismanaged, that you have mismanaged, my masters, that you have criminally and selfishly mismanaged. And on this count, you cannot answer me here tonight, face to face, any more than can your whole class answer the 1.5 million of revolutionists in the United States. You cannot answer. I challenge you to answer. And furthermore, I dare to say to you now that when I have finished, you will not answer. On that point, you will be tongue-tied, though you will talk wordily enough about other things. You have failed in your management. You have made a shambles of civilization. You have been blind and greedy. You have risen up, as you today rise up, shamelessly, in our legislative halls, and declared that profits were impossible without the toil of children and babes. Don't take my word for it. It is all in the records against you. You have lulled your conscience to sleep with prattle of sweet ideals and dear moralities. You are fat with power and possession, drunken with success. And you have no more hope against us than have the drones clustered about the honey vats when the worker bees spring upon them to end their rotund existence. You have failed in your management of society, and your management is to be taken away from you. 1.5 million of the men of the working class say that they are going to get the rest of the working class to join with them and take the management away from you. This is the revolution, my masters. Stop it if you can. For an appreciable lapse of time, Ernest's voice continued to ring through the great room. Then arose the throaty rumble I had heard before, and a dozen men were on their feet clamoring for recognition from Colonel Van Gilbert. I noticed Miss Brentwood's shoulders moving convulsively, and for the moment I was angry, for I thought that she was laughing at Ernest. And then I discovered that it was not laughter, but hysteria. She was appalled by what she had done in bringing this firebrand before her blessed Philomath Club. Colonel Van Gilbert did not notice the dozen men with passion-wrought faces who strove to get permission from him to speak. His own face was passion-wrought. He sprang to his feet, waving his arms, and for a moment could utter only incoherent sounds. Then speech poured from him. But it was not the speech of a $100,000 lawyer, nor was the rhetoric old-fashioned. "Fallacy upon fallacy," he cried. "Never in all my life have I heard so many fallacies uttered in one short hour. And besides, young man, I must tell you that you have said nothing new. I learned all that at college before you were born. Jean-Jacques Rousseau enunciated your socialistic theory nearly 2 centuries ago. A return to the soil, forsooth. Reversion. Our biology teaches the absurdity of it. It has been truly said that a little learning is a dangerous thing, and you have exemplified it tonight with your madcap theories. Fallacy upon fallacy. I was never so nauseated in my life with overplus of fallacy. That for your immature generalizations and childish reasonings." He snapped his fingers contemptuously and proceeded to sit down. There were lip exclamations of approval on the part of the women, and hoarser notes of confirmation came from the men. As for the dozen men who were clamoring for the floor, half of them began speaking at once. The confusion and babble was indescribable. Never had Mrs. Pertonwaithe's spacious walls beheld such a spectacle. These, then, were the cool captains of industry and lords of society, these snarling, growling savages in evening clothes. Truly, Ernest had shaken them when he stretched out his hands for their money-bags, his hands that had appeared in their eyes as the hands of the 1,500,000 revolutionists. But Ernest never lost his head in a situation. Before Colonel Van Gilbert had succeeded in sitting down, Ernest was on his feet and had sprung forward. "One at a time," he roared at them. The sound arose from his great lungs and dominated the human tempest. By sheer compulsion of personality, he commanded silence. "One at a time," he repeated softly. "Let me answer Colonel Van Gilbert. After that, the rest of you can come at me. But one at a time, remember. No mass plays here. This is not a football field. As for you," he went on, turning toward Colonel Van Gilbert, "you have replied to nothing I have said. You have merely made a few excited and dogmatic assertions about my mental caliber. That may serve you in your business, but you can't talk to me like that. I am not a working man, cap in hand, asking you to increase my wages or to protect me from the machine at which I work. You cannot be dogmatic with truth when you deal with me. Save that for dealing with your wage slaves. They will not dare reply to you because you hold their bread and butter, their lives in your hands. As for this return to nature that you say you learned at college before I was born, permit me to point out that on the face of it you cannot have learned anything since. Socialism has no more to do with the state of nature than has differential calculus with a Bible class. I have called your class stupid when outside the realm of business. You, sir, have brilliantly exemplified my statement." This terrible castigation of her $100,000 lawyer was too much for Miss Brentwood's nerves. Her hysteria became violent, and she was helped, weeping and laughing, out of the room. It was just as well, for there was worse to follow. "Don't take my word for it," Ernest continued, when the interruption had been led away. "Your own authorities, with one unanimous voice, will prove you stupid. Your own hired purveyors of knowledge will tell you that you are wrong. Go to your meekest little assistant instructor of sociology and ask him what is the difference between Rousseau's theory of the return to nature and the theory of socialism. Ask your greatest orthodox bourgeois political economists and sociologists. Question through the pages of every textbook written on the subject and stored on the shelves of your subsidized libraries. And from one and all the answer will be that there is nothing congruous between the return to nature and socialism. On the other hand, the unanimous affirmative answer will be that the return to nature and socialism are diametrically opposed to each other. As I say, don't take my word for it. The record of your stupidity is there in the books, your own books that you never read. And so far as your stupidity is concerned, you are but the exemplar of your class. You know law and business, Colonel Van Gilbert. You know how to serve corporations and increase dividends by twisting the law. Very good. Stick to it. You are quite a figure. You are a very good lawyer, but you are a poor historian. You know nothing of sociology, and your biology is contemporaneous with Pliny. Here, Colonel Van Gilbert writhed in his chair. There was perfect quiet in the room. Everybody sat fascinated, paralyzed, I may say. Such fearful treatment of the great Colonel Van Gilbert was unheard of, undreamed of, impossible to believe. The great Colonel Van Gilbert, before whom judges trembled when he arose in court. But Ernest never gave quarter to an enemy. "This is, of course, no reflection on you," Ernest said. "Every man to his trade. Only you stick to your trade and I'll stick to mine. You have specialized. When it comes to a knowledge of the law, of how best to evade the law or make new law for the benefit of thieving corporations, I am down in the dirt at your feet. But when it comes to sociology, my trade, you are down in the dirt at my feet. Remember that. Remember also that your law is the stuff of a day, and that you are not versatile in the stuff of more than a day. Therefore, your dogmatic assertions and rash generalizations on things historical and sociological are not worth the breath you waste on them." Ernest paused for a moment and regarded him thoughtfully, noting his face dark and twisted with anger, his panting chest, his writhing body, and his slim white hands nervously clenching and unclenching. "But it seems you have breath to use, and I'll give you a chance to use it. I indicted your class. Show me that my indictment is wrong. I pointed out to you the wretchedness of modern man, 3 million child slaves in the United States, without whose labor profits would not be possible, and 15 million underfed, ill-clothed, and worse-housed people. I pointed out that modern man's producing power through social organization and the use of machinery was 1,000 times greater than that of the caveman. And I stated that from these two facts, no other conclusion was possible than that the capitalist class had mismanaged. This was my indictment, and I specifically and at length challenged you to answer it. Nay, I did more. I prophesied that you would not answer. It remains for your breath to smash my prophecy. You called my speech fallacy. Show the fallacy, Colonel Van Gilbert. Answer the indictment that I and my 1,500,000 comrades have brought against your class and you." Colonel Van Gilbert quite forgot that he was presiding, and that in courtesy he should permit the other clamorers to speak. He was on his feet, flinging his arms, his rhetoric, and his control to the winds, alternately abusing Ernest for his youth and demagoguery, and savagely attacking the working class, elaborating its inefficiency and worthlessness. "For a lawyer, you are the hardest man to keep to a point I ever saw," Ernest began his answer to the tirade. "My youth has nothing to do with what I have enunciated, nor has the worthlessness of the working class. I charge the capitalist class with having mismanaged society. You have not answered. You have made no attempt to answer. Why? Is it because you have no answer? You are the champion of this whole audience. Every one here except me is hanging on your lips for that answer. They are hanging on your lips for that answer because they have no answer themselves. And as for me, as I said before, I know that you not only cannot answer, but that you will not attempt an answer." "This is intolerable," Colonel Van Gilbert cried out. "This is insult." "That you should not answer is intolerable," Ernest replied gravely. "No man can be intellectually insulted. Insult, in its very nature, is emotional. Recover yourself. Give me an intellectual answer to my intellectual charge that the capitalist class has mismanaged society." Colonel Van Gilbert remained silent, a sullen, superior expression on his face, such as will appear on the face of a man who will not bandy words with a ruffian. "Do not be downcast," Ernest said. "Take consolation in the fact that no member of your class has ever yet answered that charge." He turned to the other men who were anxious to speak. "And now it's your chance. Fire away. And do not forget that I here challenge you to give the answer that Colonel Van Gilbert has failed to give." It would be impossible for me to write all that was said in the discussion. I never realized before how many words could be spoken in 3 short hours. At any rate, it was glorious. The more his opponents grew excited, the more Ernest deliberately excited them. He had an encyclopedic command of the field of knowledge, and by a word or a phrase, by delicate rapier thrusts, he punctured them. He named the points of their logic. This was a false syllogism. That conclusion had no connection with the premise, while that next premise was an impostor because it had cunningly hidden in it the conclusion that was being attempted to be proved. This was an error, that was an assumption, and the next was an assertion contrary to ascertained truth as printed in all the textbooks. And so it went. Sometimes he exchanged the rapier for the club and went smashing amongst their thoughts right and left. And always he demanded facts and refused to discuss theories. And his facts made for them a Waterloo. When they attacked the working class, he always retorted, "The pot calling the kettle black. That is no answer to the charge that your own face is dirty." And to one and all he said, "Why have you not answered the charge that your class is mismanaged? You've talked about other things and things concerning other things, but you have not answered. Is it because you have no answer?" It was at the end of the discussion that Mr. Wickson spoke. He was the only one that was cool, and Ernest treated him with a respect he had not accorded the others. "No answer is necessary," Mr. Wickson said with slow deliberation. "I have followed the whole discussion with amazement and disgust. I am disgusted with you, gentlemen, members of my class. You have behaved like foolish little schoolboys, what with intruding ethics and the thunder of the common politician into such a discussion. You have been out-generaled and outclassed. You have been very wordy, and all you have done is buzz. You have buzzed like gnats about a bear. Gentlemen, there stands the bear," he pointed at Ernest, "and your buzzing has only tickled his ears. Believe me, the situation is serious. That bear reached out his paws tonight to crush us. He has said there are 1.5 million of revolutionists in the United States. That is a fact. He has said that it is their intention to take away from us our governments, our palaces, and all our purpled ease. That also is a fact. A change, a great change, is coming in society. But, happily, it may not be the change the bear anticipates. The bear has said that he will crush us. What if we crush the bear?" The throat rumble arose in the great room, and man nodded to man with endorsement and certitude. Their faces were set hard. They were fighters, that was certain. "But not by buzzing will we crush the bear," Mr. Wickson went on coldly and dispassionately. "We will hunt the bear. We will not reply to the bear in words. Our reply shall be couched in terms of lead. We are in power. Nobody will deny it. By virtue of that power, we shall remain in power." He turned suddenly upon Ernest. The moment was dramatic. "This, then, is our answer. We have no words to waste on you. When you reach out your vaunted strong hands for our palaces and purpled ease, we will show you what strength is. In roar of shell and shrapnel and in whine of machine guns will our answer be couched." Note: to show the tenor of thought, the following definition is quoted from the Cynic's Wordbook, 1906 AD, written by one Ambrose Bierce, an avowed and confirmed misanthrope of the period. Grape shot, noun, an argument which the future is preparing in answer to the demands of American socialism. "We will grind you revolutionists down under our heel, and we shall walk upon your faces. The world is ours. We are its lords, and ours it shall remain. As for the host of labor, it has been in the dirt since history began, and I read history aright. And in the dirt it shall remain so long as I and mine and those that come after us have the power. There is the word. It is the king of words. Power. Not God, not mammon, but power. Pour it over your tongue till it tingles with it. Power. "I am answered," Ernest said quietly. "It is the only answer that could be given. Power. It is what we of the working class preach. We know, and well we know by bitter experience, that no appeal for the right, for justice, for humanity, can ever touch you. Your hearts are hard as your heels with which you tread upon the faces of the poor. So we have preached power. By the power of our ballots on election day will we take your government away from you." "What if you do get a majority, a sweeping majority on election day?" Mr. Wickson broke in to demand. "Suppose we refuse to turn the government over to you after you have captured it at the ballot box?" "That also have we considered," Ernest replied, "and we shall give you an answer in terms of lead. Power you have proclaimed the king of words. Very good. Power it shall be. And in the day that we sweep to victory at the ballot box, and you refuse to turn over to us the government we have constitutionally and peacefully captured, and you demand what we are going to do about it, in that day, I say, we shall answer you. And in roar of shell and shrapnel, and in whine of machine guns shall our answer be couched. You cannot escape us. It is true that you have read history aright. It is true that labor has from the beginning of history been in the dirt, and it is equally true that so long as you and yours and those that come after you have power, that labor shall remain in the dirt. I agree with you. I agree with all that you have said. Power will be the arbiter, as it always has been the arbiter. It is a struggle of classes. Just as your class dragged down the old feudal nobility, so shall it be dragged down by my class, the working class. If you will read your biology and your sociology as clearly as you do your history, you will see that this end I have described is inevitable. It does not matter whether it is in 1 year, 10, or 1,000. Your class shall be dragged down, and it shall be done by power. We of the labor hosts have conned that word over till our minds are all a-tingle with it. Power. It is a kingly word. And so ended the night with the Philomaths. Chapter 6 of The Iron Heel by Jack London. Adumbrations. It was about this time that the warnings of coming events began to fall about us thick and fast. Ernest had already questioned Father's policy of having socialists and labor leaders at his house, and of openly attending socialist meetings, and Father had only laughed at him for his pains. As for myself, I was learning much from this contact with the working-class leaders and thinkers. I was seeing the other side of the shield. I was delighted with the unselfishness and high idealism I encountered, though I was appalled by the vast philosophic and scientific literature of socialism that was opened up to me. I was learning fast, but I learned not fast enough to realize then the peril of our position. There were warnings, but I did not heed them. For instance, Mrs. Pertonwaithe and Mrs. Wickson exercised tremendous social power in the university town, and from them emanated the sentiment that I was a too forward and self-assertive young woman with a mischievous penchant for officiousness and interference in other persons' affairs. This I thought no more than natural, considering the part I had played in investigating the case of Jackson's arm. But the effect of such a sentiment, enunciated by two such powerful social arbiters, I underestimated. True, I noticed a certain aloofness on the part of my general friends, but this I ascribed to the disapproval that was prevalent in my circles of my intended marriage with Ernest. It was not till some time afterward that Ernest pointed out to me clearly that this general attitude of my class was something more than spontaneous, that behind it were the hidden springs of an organized conduct. "You have given shelter to an enemy of your class," he said, "and not alone shelter, for you have given your love, yourself. This is treason to your class. Think not that you will escape being penalized." But it was before this that Father returned one afternoon. Ernest was with me, and we could see that Father was angry, philosophically angry. He was rarely really angry, but a certain measure of controlled anger he allowed himself. He called it a tonic, and we could see that he was tonic angry when he entered the room. "What do you think?" he demanded. "I had luncheon with Wilcox." Wilcox was the superannuated president of the university, whose withered mind was stored with generalizations that were young in 1870 and which he had since failed to revise. "I was invited," Father announced. "I was sent for." He paused, and we waited. Oh, it was done very nicely, I'll allow, but I was reprimanded. I, and by that old fossil. I'll wager I know what you were reprimanded for, Ernest said. Not in 3 guesses, Father laughed. Oh, 1 guess will do, Ernest retorted. And it won't be a guess. It will be a deduction. You were reprimanded for your private life. The very thing, Father cried. How did you guess? I knew it was coming. I warned you before about it. Yes, you did, Father meditated. But I couldn't believe it. At any rate, it is only so much more clinching evidence for my book. It is nothing to what will come, Ernest went on, if you persist in your policy of having these socialists and radicals of all sorts at your house, myself included. Just what old Wilcox said. And of all unwarranted things, he said it was in poor taste, utterly profitless anyway, and not in harmony with university traditions and policy. He said much more of the same vague sort, and I couldn't pin him down to anything specific. I made it pretty awkward for him, and he could only go on repeating himself and telling me how much he honored me, and all the world honored me as a scientist. It wasn't an agreeable task for him. I could see he didn't like it. He was not a free agent, Ernest said. The leg bar is not always worn graciously. Note, leg bar. The African slaves were so manacled, also criminals. It was not until the coming of the Brotherhood of Man that the leg bar passed out of use. Yes, I got that much out of him. He said the university needed ever so much more money this year than the state was willing to furnish, and that it must come from wealthy personages who could not but be offended by the swerving of the university from its high ideal of the passionless pursuit of passionless intelligence. When I tried to pin him down to what my home life had to do with swerving the university from its high ideal, he offered me a 2 years' vacation on full pay in Europe for recreation and research. Of course, I couldn't accept it under the circumstances. Oh, it would have been far better if you had, Ernest said gravely. It was a bribe, Father protested, and Ernest nodded. Also, the beggar said that there was talk, tea-table gossip and so forth, about my daughter being seen in public with so notorious a character as you, and it was not in keeping with university tone and dignity. Not that he personally objected, oh no, but that there was talk, and that I would understand. Ernest considered this announcement for a moment and then said, and his face was very grave, withal there was a somber wrath in it. There is more behind this than a mere university ideal. Somebody has put pressure on President Wilcox. Do you think so? Father asked, and his face showed that he was interested rather than frightened. I wish I could convey to you the conception that is dimly forming in my own mind, Ernest said. Never in the history of the world was society in so terrible flux as it is right now. The swift changes in our industrial system are causing equally swift changes in our religious, political, and social structures. An unseen and fearful revolution is taking place in the fiber and structure of society. One can only dimly feel these things, but they are in the air, now, today. One can feel the loom of them, things vast, vague, and terrible. My mind recoils from contemplation of what they may crystallize into. You heard Wickson talk the other night. Behind what he said were the same nameless, formless things that I feel. He spoke out of a superconscious apprehension of them. You mean, Father began, then paused. I mean that there is a shadow of something colossal and menacing that even now is beginning to fall across the land. Call it the shadow of an oligarchy, if you will. It is the nearest I dare approximate it. What its nature may be, I refuse to imagine. But what I wanted to say was this. You are in a perilous position, a peril that my own fear enhances because I am not able even to measure it. Take my advice and accept the vacation. Note, though, like Everhard, they did not dream of the nature of it, there were men, even before his time, who caught glimpses of the shadow. John C. Calhoun said, "A power has risen up in the government greater than the people themselves, consisting of many and various and powerful interests combined into one mass and held together by the cohesive power of the vast surplus in the banks." And that great humanist, Abraham Lincoln, said just before his assassination, "I see in the near future a crisis approaching that unnerves me and causes me to tremble for the safety of my country. Corporations have been enthroned, an era of corruption in high places will follow,
and the money power of the country will endeavor to prolong its reign by working upon the prejudices of the people until the wealth is aggregated in a few hands and the republic is destroyed." "But it would be cowardly," was the protest. "Not at all. You're an old man. You have done your work in the world, and a great work. Leave the present battle to youth and strength. We young fellows have our work yet to do. Avis will stand by my side in what is to come. She will be your representative in the battlefront." "Oh, but they can't hurt me," father objected. "Thank God I am independent. Oh, I assure you, I know the frightful persecution they can wage on a professor who is economically dependent on his university. But I am independent. I have not been a professor for the sake of my salary. I can get along very comfortably on my own income, and the salary is all they can take away from me." "But you do not realize," Ernest answered, "if all that I fear be so, your private income, your principal itself, can be taken from you just as easily as your salary." Father was silent for a few minutes. He was thinking deeply, and I could see the lines of decision forming in his face. At last he spoke. "I shall not take the vacation." He paused again. "I shall go on with my book. You may be wrong, but whether you are wrong or right, I shall stand by my guns." Note: this book, Economics and Education, was published in that year. 3 copies of it are extant, 2 at Ardis and 1 at Asgard. It dealt in elaborate detail with one factor in the persistence of the established, namely the capitalistic bias of the universities and common schools. It was a logical and crushing indictment of the whole system of education that developed in the minds of the students only such ideas as were favorable to the capitalistic regime, to the exclusion of all ideas that were inimical and subversive. The book created a furor and was promptly suppressed by the oligarchy. "All right," Ernest said. "You are traveling the same path that Bishop Morehouse is, and toward a similar smash-up. You'll both be proletarians before you're done with it." The conversation turned upon the bishop, and we got Ernest to explain what he had been doing with him. "He is soul-sick from the journey through hell I have given him. I took him through the homes of a few of our factory workers. I showed him the human wrecks cast aside by the industrial machine, and he listened to their life stories. I took him through the slums of San Francisco, and in drunkenness, prostitution, and criminality he learned a deeper cause than innate depravity. He is very sick, and worse than that, he has got out of hand. He is too ethical. He's been too severely touched. And as usual, he is unpractical. He is up in the air with all kinds of ethical delusions and plans for mission work among the cultured. He feels it is his bounden duty to resurrect the ancient spirit of the church and to deliver its message to the masters. He is overwrought. Sooner or later, he is going to break out, and then there's going to be a smash-up. What form it will take, I can't even guess. He is a pure, exalted soul, but he is so unpractical. He's beyond me. I can't keep his feet on the earth, and through the air he is rushing on to his Gethsemane. And after this, his crucifixion. Such high souls are made for crucifixion." "And you?" I asked, and beneath my smile was the seriousness of the anxiety of love. "Oh, not I," he laughed back. "I may be executed or assassinated, but I shall never be crucified. I am planted too solidly and stolidly upon the earth." "But why should you bring about the crucifixion of the bishop?" I asked. "You will not deny that you are the cause of it." "Or why should I leave one comfortable soul in comfort when there are millions in travail and misery?" he demanded back. "Then why did you advise father to accept the vacation?" "Because I am not a pure, exalted soul," was the answer. "Because I am solid and stolid and selfish. Because I love you, and like Ruth of old, thy people are my people. As for the bishop, he has no daughter. Besides, no matter how small the good, nevertheless his little inadequate wail will be productive of some good in the revolution, and every little bit counts." I could not agree with Ernest. I knew well the noble nature of Bishop Morehouse, and I could not conceive that his voice raised for righteousness would be no more than a little inadequate wail. But I did not yet have the harsh facts of life at my fingers' ends as Ernest had. He saw clearly the futility of the bishop's great soul, as coming events were soon to show as clearly to me. It was shortly after this day that Ernest told me, as a good story, the offer he had received from the government, namely, an appointment as United States Commissioner of Labor. I was overjoyed. The salary was comparatively large and would make safe our marriage. And then it surely was congenial work for Ernest. And, furthermore, my jealous pride in him made me hail the proffered appointment as a recognition of his abilities. And I noticed the twinkle in his eyes. He was laughing at me. "You are not going to decline," I quavered. "It is a bribe," he said. "Behind it is the fine hand of Wickson, and behind him the hands of greater men than he. It is an old trick, old as the class struggle is old, stealing the captains from the army of labor. Poor betrayed labor. If you but knew how many of its leaders have been bought out in similar ways in the past. It is cheaper, so much cheaper to buy a general than to fight him and his whole army. There was, but I'll not call any names. I'm bitter enough over it as it is. Dear heart, I am a captain of labor. I could not sell out. If for no other reason, the memory of my poor old father and the way he was worked to death would prevent." The tears were in his eyes, this great, strong hero of mine. He never could forgive the way his father had been malformed, the sordid lies and the petty thefts he had been compelled to in order to put food in his children's mouths. "My father was a good man," Ernest once said to me. "The soul of him was good, and yet it was twisted and maimed and blunted by the savagery of his life. He was made into a broken-down beast by his masters, the arch-beasts. He should be alive today, like your father. He had a strong constitution, but he was caught in the machine and worked to death. For profit. Think of it, for profit. His life-blood transmuted into a wine supper or a jeweled gewgaw or some similar sense orgy of the parasitic and idle rich. His masters, the arch-beasts."
Chapter 7 of The Iron Heel by Jack London. The Bishop's Vision.
"The bishop is out of hand," Ernest wrote me. "He is clear up in the air. Tonight he is going to begin putting to rights this very miserable world of ours. He is going to deliver his message. He has told me so, and I cannot dissuade him. Tonight he is chairman of the IPH, and he will embody his message in his introductory remarks. Note: there is no clue to the name of the organization for which these initials stand. May I bring you to hear him? Of course, he is foredoomed to futility. It will break your heart. It will break his. But for you, it will be an excellent object lesson. You know, dear heart, how proud I am because you love me. And because of that, I want you to know my fullest value. I want to redeem in your eyes some small measure of my unworthiness. And so it is that my pride desires that you shall know my thinking is correct and right. My views are harsh. The futility of so noble a soul as the bishop will show you the compulsion for such harshness. So come tonight. Sad though this night's happening will be, I feel that it will but draw you more closely to me." The IPH held its convention that night in San Francisco. Note: it took but a few minutes to cross by ferry from Berkeley to San Francisco. These and the other Bay cities practically composed one community. This convention had been called to consider public immorality and the remedy for it. Bishop Morehouse presided. He was very nervous as he sat on the platform, and I could see the high tension he was under. By his side were Bishop Dickinson, H. Jones, the head of the ethical department in the University of California, Mrs. W. Hurd, the great charity organizer, Philip Ward, the equally great philanthropist, and several lesser luminaries in the field of morality and charity. Bishop Morehouse arose and abruptly began. "I was in my brougham, driving through the streets. It was night time. Now and then I looked through the carriage windows, and suddenly my eyes seemed to be opened, and I saw things as they really are. At first I covered my eyes with my hands to shut out the awful sight, and then, in the darkness, the question came to me, what is to be done? What is to be done? A little later the question came to me in another way. What would the Master do? And with the question a great light seemed to fill the place, and I saw my duty sun-clear as Saul saw his on the way to Damascus. I stopped the carriage, got out, and after a few minutes' conversation persuaded 2 of the public women to get into the brougham with me. If Jesus was right, then these 2 unfortunates were my sisters, and the only hope of their purification was in my affection and tenderness. I live in one of the loveliest localities of San Francisco. The house in which I live cost $100,000, and its furnishings, books, and works of art cost as much more. The house is a mansion. No, it is a palace, wherein there are many servants. I never knew what palaces were good for. I had thought they were to live in. But now I know. I took the 2 women of the street to my palace, and they are going to stay with me. I hope to fill every room in my palace with such sisters as they. The audience had been growing more and more restless and unsettled, and the faces of those that sat on the platform had been betraying greater and greater dismay and consternation. And at this point, Bishop Dickinson arose, and with an expression of disgust on his face, fled from the platform and the hall. But Bishop Morehouse, oblivious to all, his eyes filled with his vision, continued. "Oh, sisters and brothers, in this act of mine I find the solution of all my difficulties. I didn't know what brooms were made for, but now I know. They are made to carry the weak, the sick, and the aged. They are made to show honor to those who have lost the sense even of shame. I did not know what palaces were made for, but now I have found a use for them. The palaces of the church should be hospitals and nurseries for those who have fallen by the wayside and are perishing." He made a long pause, plainly overcome by the thought that was in him, and nervous how best to express it. "I am not fit, dear brethren, to tell you anything about morality. I have lived in shame and hypocrisies too long to be able to help others, but my action with those women, sisters of mine, shows me that the better way is easy to find. To those who believe in Jesus and his gospel, there can be no other relation between man and man than the relation of affection. Love alone is stronger than sin, stronger than death. I therefore say to the rich among you that it is their duty to do what I have done and am doing. Let each one of you who is prosperous take into his house some thief and treat him as his brother, some unfortunate and treat her as his sister, and San Francisco will need no police force and no magistrates. The prisons will be turned into hospitals, and the criminal will disappear with his crime. We must give ourselves, and not our money alone. We must do as Christ did. That is the message of the church today. We have wandered far from the Master's teaching. We are consumed in our own flesh pots. We have put mammon in the place of Christ. I have here a poem that tells the whole story. I should like to read it to you. It was written by an erring soul who yet saw clearly. Note: Oscar Wilde, one of the lords of language of the 19th century of the Christian era. It must not be mistaken for an attack upon the Catholic Church. It is an attack upon all churches, upon the pomp and splendor of all churches that have wandered from the Master's path and hedged themselves in from his lambs. Here it is. The silver trumpets rang across the dome. The people knelt upon the ground with awe. And borne upon the necks of men I saw, like some great god, the Holy Lord of Rome. Priest-like, he wore a robe more white than foam, and king-like swathed himself in royal red. 3 crowns of gold rose high upon his head. In splendor and in light the Pope passed home. My heart stole back across wide wastes of years to one who wandered by a lonely sea, and sought in vain for any place of rest. Foxes have holes, and every bird its nest. I, only I, must wander wearily, and bruise my feet, and drink wine salt with tears. The audience was agitated, but unresponsive. Yet Bishop Morehouse was not aware of it. He held steadily on his way. And so I say to the rich among you, and to all the rich, that bitterly you oppress the Master's lambs. You have hardened your hearts. You have closed your ears to the voices that are crying in the land, the voices of pain and sorrow that you will not hear, but that someday will be heard. And so I say—" But at this point, H. Jones and Philip Ward, who had already risen from their chairs, led the bishop off the platform, while the audience sat breathless and shocked. Ernest laughed harshly and savagely when he had gained the street. His laughter jarred upon me. My heart seemed ready to burst with suppressed tears. "He has delivered his message," Ernest cried. The manhood and the deep, hidden, tender nature of their bishop burst out, and his Christian audience that loved him concluded that he was crazy. Did you see them leading him so solicitously from the platform? There must have been laughter in hell at the spectacle. Nevertheless, it will make a great impression, what the bishop did and said tonight, I said. Think so? Ernest queried mockingly. It will make a sensation, I asserted. Didn't you see the reporters scribbling like mad while he was speaking? Not a line of which will appear in tomorrow's papers. I can't believe it, I cried. Just wait and see, was the answer. Not a line, not a thought that he uttered. The daily press, the daily suppressage. But the reporters, I objected. I saw them. Not a word that he uttered will see print. You have forgotten the editors. They draw their salaries for the policy they maintain. Their policy is to print nothing that is a vital menace to the established. The bishop's utterance was a violent assault upon the established morality. It was heresy. They led him from the platform to prevent him from uttering more heresy. The newspapers will purge his heresy in the oblivion of silence. The press of the United States, it is a parasitic growth that battens on the capitalist class. Its function is to serve the established by molding public opinion, and right well it serves it. Let me prophesy. Tomorrow's papers will merely mention that the bishop is in poor health, that he has been working too hard, and that he broke down last night. The next mention, some days hence, will be to the effect that he is suffering from nervous prostration and has been given a vacation by his grateful flock. After that, one of two things will happen. Either the bishop will see the error of his way and return from his vacation a well man in whose eyes there are no more visions, or else he will persist in his madness, and then you may expect to see in the papers, couched pathetically and tenderly, the announcement of his insanity. After that, he will be left to gibber his visions to padded walls. Now there you go too far, I cried out. In the eyes of society, it will truly be insanity, he replied. What honest man who is not insane would take lost women and thieves into his house to dwell with him sisterly and brotherly? True, Christ died between two thieves, but that is another story. Insanity? The mental processes of the man with whom one disagrees are always wrong. Therefore, the mind of the man is wrong. Where is the line between wrong mind and insane mind? It is inconceivable that any sane man can radically disagree with one's most sane conclusions. There is a good example of it in this evening's paper. Mary McKenna lives south of Market Street. She is a poor but honest woman. She is also patriotic. But she has erroneous ideas concerning the American flag and the protection it is supposed to symbolize. And here's what happened to her. Her husband had an accident and was laid up in hospital 3 months. In spite of taking in washing, she got behind in her rent. Yesterday, they evicted her. But first, she hoisted an American flag, and from under its folds she announced that by virtue of its protection they could not turn her out onto the cold street. What was done? She was arrested and arraigned for insanity. Today she was examined by the regular insanity experts. She was found insane. She was consigned to the Napa Asylum. Oh, but that is far-fetched, I objected. Suppose I should disagree with everybody about the literary style of a book. They wouldn't send me to an asylum for that. Very true, he replied. But such divergence of opinion would constitute no menace to society. Therein lies the difference. The divergence of opinion on the parts of Mary McKenna and the bishop do menace society. What if all the poor people should refuse to pay rent and shelter themselves under the American flag? Landlordism would go crumbling. The bishop's views are just as perilous to society, ergo, to the asylum with him. But I still refuse to believe. Wait and see, Ernest said. And I waited. Next morning I sent out for all the papers. So far Ernest was right. Not a word that Bishop Morehouse had uttered was in print. Mention was made in 1 or 2 of the papers that he had been overcome by his feelings. Yet the platitudes of the speakers that followed him were reported at length. Several days later the brief announcement was made that he had gone away on a vacation to recover from the effects of overwork. So far so good, but there had been no hint of insanity, nor even of nervous collapse. Little did I dream the terrible road the bishop was destined to travel, the Gethsemane and crucifixion that Ernest had pondered about. Chapter 8 of The Iron Heel by Jack London. The Machine Breakers. It was just before Ernest ran for Congress on the socialist ticket that father gave what he privately called his profit and loss dinner. Ernest called it the dinner of the machine breakers. In point of fact, it was merely a dinner for businessmen, small businessmen, of course. I doubt if one of them was interested in any business the total capitalization of which exceeded a couple of $100,000. They were truly representative middle-class businessmen. There was Owen of Silverberg, Owen and Company, a large grocery firm with several branch stores. We bought our groceries from them. They were both partners of the big drug firm of Cowalt and Washburn, and Mr. Asmundsen, the owner of a large granite quarry in Contra Costa County. And there were many similar men, owners or part owners in small factories, small businesses, and small industries. Small capitalists, in short. They were shrewd-faced, interesting men, and they talked with simplicity and clearness. Their unanimous complaint was against the corporations and trusts. Their creed was, "Bust the trusts." All oppression originated in the trusts, and one and all told the same tale of woe. They advocated government ownership of such trusts as the railroads and telegraphs, and excessive income taxes, graduated with ferocity to destroy large accumulations. Likewise, they advocated as a cure for local ills municipal ownership of such public utilities as water, gas, telephones, and street railways. Especially interesting was Mr. Amundsen's narrative of his tribulations as a quarry owner. He confessed that he never made any profits out of his quarry, and this in spite of the enormous volume of business that had been caused by the destruction of San Francisco by the big earthquake. For 6 years, the rebuilding of San Francisco had been going on, and his business had quadrupled and octupled, and yet he was no better off. "The railroad knows my business just a little bit better than I do," he said. "It knows my operating expenses to a cent, and it knows the terms of my contracts. How it knows these things, I can only guess. It must have spies in my employ, and it must have access to the parties to all my contracts. For look you, when I place a big contract, the terms of which favor me a goodly profit, the freight rate from my quarry to market is promptly raised. No explanation is made. The railroad gets my profit. Under such circumstances, I have never succeeded in getting the railroad to reconsider its raise. On the other hand, when there have been accidents, increased expenses of operating, or contracts with less profitable terms, I have always succeeded in getting the railroad to lower its rate. What is the result? Large or small, the railroad always gets my profits." "What remains to you over and above," Ernest interrupted to ask, "would roughly be the equivalent of your salary as a manager did the railroad own the quarry." "The very thing," Mr. Asmundsen replied. "Only a short time ago I had my books gone through for the past 10 years. I discovered that for those 10 years my gain was just equivalent to a manager's salary. The railroad might just as well have owned my quarry and hired me to run it." "But with this difference," Ernest laughed. "The railroad would have had to assume all the risk which you so obligingly assumed for it." "Very true," Mr. Asmundsen answered sadly. Having let them have their say, Ernest began asking questions right and left. He began with Mr. Owen. "You started a branch store here in Berkeley about 6 months ago?" "Yes," Mr. Owen answered. "And since then I've noticed that 3 little corner groceries have gone out of business. Was your branch store the cause of it?" Mr. Owen affirmed with a complacent smile. "They had no chance against us." "Why not?" "We had greater capital. With a large business there is always less waste and greater efficiency." "And your branch store absorbed the profits of the 3 small ones. I see. But tell me, what became of the owners of the 3 stores?" "One is driving a delivery wagon for us. I don't know what happened to the other 2. Ernest turned abruptly on Mr. Cowalt. "You sell a great deal at cut rates. What have become of the owners of the small drug stores that you forced to the wall?" Note: cut rates. A lowering of selling price to cost and even to less than cost. Thus, a large company could sell at a loss for a longer period than a small company, and so drive the small company out of business, a common device of competition. "One of them, Mr. Hasfurther, has charge now of our prescription department," was the answer. "And you absorbed the profits they had been making?" "Surely. That is what we are in business for." "And you?" Ernest said suddenly to Mr. Asmundsen. "You are disgusted because the railroad has absorbed your profits?" Mr. Asmundsen nodded. "What you want is to make profits yourself." Again, Mr. Asmundsen nodded. "Out of others?" There was no answer. "Out of others?" Ernest insisted. "That is the way profits are made," Mr. Asmundsen replied curtly. "Then the business game is to make profits out of others and to prevent others from making profits out of you. That's it, isn't it?" Ernest had to repeat his question before Mr. Asmundsen gave an answer. And then he said, "Yes, that's it, except that we do not object to the others making profits, so long as they are not extortionate." "By extortionate you mean large. Yet you do not object to making large profits yourself. Surely not." And Mr. Asmundsen amiably confessed to the weakness. There was one other man who was quizzed by Ernest at this juncture, a Mr. Calvin, who had once been a great dairy owner. "Some time ago you were fighting the Milk Trust," Ernest said to him, "and now you are in Grange politics. How did this happen?" Note: Grange politics. Many efforts were made during this period to organize the perishing farmer class into a political party, the aim of which was to destroy the trusts and corporations by drastic legislation. All such attempts ended in failure. "Oh, I haven't quit the fight," Mr. Calvin answered, and he looked belligerent enough. "I'm fighting the trust on the only field where it is possible to fight, the political field. Let me show you. A few years ago, we dairymen had everything our own way." "But you competed among yourselves," Ernest interrupted. "Yes, that was what kept the profits down. We did try to organize, but independent dairymen always broke through us. And then came the Milk Trust." "Financed by surplus capital from Standard Oil," Ernest said. Note: Standard Oil, the first successful great trust, almost a generation in advance of the rest. "Yes," Mr. Calvin acknowledged, "but we did not know it at the time. Its agents approached us with a club. Come in and be fat was their proposition, or stay out and starve. Most of us came in. Those that didn't starved. Oh, it paid us, at first. Milk was raised a cent a quart. 1/4 of this cent came to us. 3/4 of it went to the trust. Then milk was raised another cent, only we didn't get any of that cent. Our complaints were useless. The trust was in control. We discovered that we were pawns. Finally, the additional 1/4 of a cent was denied us. Then the trust began to squeeze us out. What could we do? We were squeezed out. There were no dairymen, only a milk trust." "But with milk 2 cents higher, I should think you could have competed," Ernest suggested slyly. "So we thought. We tried it." Mr. Calvin paused a moment. "It broke us. The trust could put milk upon the market more cheaply than we. It could sell still at a slight profit when we were selling at actual loss. I dropped $50,000 in that venture. Most of us went bankrupt. The dairymen were wiped out of existence." Note: Bankruptcy, a peculiar institution that enabled an individual who had failed in competitive industry to forego paying his debts. The effect was to ameliorate the too savage conditions of the fang-and-claw social struggle. "So the trust took your profits away from you," Ernest said, "and you've gone into politics in order to legislate the trust out of existence and get the profits back?" Mr. Calvin's face lighted up. "That is precisely what I say in my speeches to the farmers. That's our whole idea in a nutshell." "And yet the trust produces milk more cheaply than could the independent dairymen?" Ernest queried. "Why shouldn't it, with the splendid organization and new machinery its large capital makes possible?" "There is no discussion," Ernest answered. "It certainly should, and furthermore, it does." Mr. Calvin had launched out into a political speech in exposition of his views. He was warmly followed by a number of the others, and the cry of all was to destroy the trusts. "Poor simple folk," Ernest said to me in an undertone. "They see clearly as far as they see, but they see only to the ends of their noses." A little later he got the floor again, and in his characteristic way controlled it for the rest of the evening. "I have listened carefully to all of you," he began, "and I see plainly that you play the business game in the orthodox fashion. Life sums itself up to you in profits. You have a firm and abiding belief that you were created for the sole purpose of making profits. Only there's a hitch. In the midst of your own profit-making, along comes the trust and takes your profits away from you. This is a dilemma that interferes somehow with the aim of creation, and the only way out, as it seems to you, is to destroy that which takes from you your profits. I have listened carefully, and there is only one name that will epitomize you. I shall call you that name. You are machine breakers. Do you know what a machine breaker is? Let me tell you. In the 18th century, in England, men and women wove cloth on hand looms in their own cottages. It was a slow, clumsy, and costly way of weaving cloth, this cottage system of manufacture. Along came the steam engine and labor-saving machinery. 1,000 looms assembled in a large factory and driven by a central engine wove cloth vastly more cheaply than could the cottage weavers on their hand looms. Here in the factory was combination, and before it competition faded away. The men and women who had worked the hand looms for themselves now went into the factories and worked the machine looms, not for themselves but for the capitalist owners. Furthermore, little children went to work on the machine looms at lower wages and displaced the men. This made hard times for the men. Their standard of living fell. They starved, and they said it was all the fault of the machines. Therefore, they proceeded to break the machines. And they did not succeed, and they were very stupid. Yet you have not learned their lesson. Here are you, a century and a half later, trying to break machines. By your own confession, the trust machines do the work more efficiently and more cheaply than you can. That is why you cannot compete with them. And yet you would break those machines. You are even more stupid than the stupid workmen of England. And while you maunder about restoring competition, the trusts go on destroying you. One and all, you tell the same story, the passing away of competition and the coming on of combination. You, Mr. Owen, destroyed competition here in Berkeley when your branch store drove the 3 small groceries out of business. Your combination was more effective. Yet you feel the pressure of other combinations on you, the trust combinations, and you cry out. It is because you are not a trust. If you were a grocery trust for the whole United States, you would be singing another song. And the song would be, "Blessed are the trusts." And yet again, not only is your small combination not a trust, but you are aware yourself of its lack of strength. You are beginning to divine your own end. You feel yourself and your branch stores a pawn in the game. You see the powerful interests rising and growing more powerful day by day. You feel their mailed hands descending upon your profits and taking a pinch here and a pinch there, the railroad trust, the oil trust, the steel trust, the coal trust. And you know that in the end they will destroy you, take away from you the last % of your little profits. You, sir, are a poor gamester. When you squeezed out the 3 small groceries here in Berkeley by virtue of your superior combination, you swelled out your chest, talked about efficiency and enterprise, and sent your wife to Europe on the profits you had gained by eating up the 3 small groceries. It is dog eat dog, and you ate them up. But on the other hand, you are being eaten up in turn by the bigger dogs, wherefore you squeal. And what I say to you is true of all of you at this table. You are all squealing. You are all playing the losing game, and you are all squealing about it. But when you squeal, you don't state the situation flatly, as I have stated it. You don't say that you like to squeeze profits out of others, and that you are making all the row because others are squeezing your profits out of you. No, you are too cunning for that. You say something else. You make small capitalist political speeches such as Mr. Calvin made. What did he say? Here are a few of his phrases I caught. Our original principles are all right. What this country requires is a return to fundamental American methods, free opportunity for all. The spirit of liberty in which this nation was born. Let us return to the principles of our forefathers. When he says free opportunity for all, he means free opportunity to squeeze profits, which freedom of opportunity is now denied him by the great trusts. And the absurd thing about it is that you have repeated these phrases so often that you believe them. You want opportunity to plunder your fellow men in your own small way, but you hypnotize yourselves into thinking you want freedom. You are piggish and acquisitive, but the magic of your phrases leads you to believe that you are patriotic. You desire for profits, which is sheer selfishness. You metamorphose into altruistic solicitude for suffering humanity. Come on now, right here amongst ourselves, and be honest for once. Look the matter in the face and state it in direct terms. There were flushed and angry faces at the table, and withal a measure of awe. They were a little frightened at this smooth-faced young fellow, and the swing and smash of his words, and his dreadful trait of calling a spade a spade. Mr. Calvin promptly replied. "And why not?" he demanded. "Why can we not return to ways of our fathers when this republic was founded? You have spoken much truth, Mr. Everhard, unpalatable though it has been. But here amongst ourselves let us speak out. Let us throw off all disguise and accept the truth as Mr. Everhard has flatly stated it. It is true that we smaller capitalists are after profits, and that the trusts are taking our profits away from us. It is true that we want to destroy the trusts in order that our profits may remain to us. And why can we not do it? Why not, I say? Why not? Ah, now we come to the gist of the matter, Ernest said with a pleased expression. I'll try to tell you why not, though the telling will be rather hard. You see, you fellows have studied business in a small way, but you have not studied social evolution at all. You are in the midst of a transition stage now in economic evolution, but you do not understand it, and that's what causes all of the confusion. Why cannot you return? Because you can't. You can no more make water run uphill than you can cause the tide of economic evolution to flow back in its channel along the way it came. Joshua made the sun stand still upon Gibeon, but you would outdo Joshua. You would make the sun go backward in the sky. You would have time retrace its steps from noon to morning. In the face of labor-saving machinery, of organized production, of the increased efficiency of combination, you would set the economic sun back a whole generation or so to the time when there were no great capitalists, no great machinery, no railroads, a time when a host of little capitalists warred with each other in economic anarchy, and when production was primitive, wasteful, unorganized, and costly. Believe me, Joshua's task was easier, and he had Jehovah to help him. But God has forsaken you small capitalists. The sun of the small capitalists is setting. It will never rise again. Nor is it in your power even to make it stand still. You are perishing, and you are doomed to perish utterly from the face of society. This is the fiat of evolution. It is the word of God. Combination is stronger than competition. Primitive man was a puny creature hiding in the crevices of the rocks. He combined and made war upon his carnivorous enemies. They were competitive beasts. Primitive man was a combinative beast, and because of it he rose to primacy over all the animals. And man has been achieving greater and greater combinations ever since. It is combination versus competition, a 1,000 centuries-long struggle in which competition has always been worsted. Whoso enlists on the side of competition perishes. But the trusts themselves arose out of competition, Mr. Calvin interrupted. Very true, Ernest answered. And the trusts themselves destroyed competition. That, by your own word, is why you are no longer in the dairy business. The first laughter of the evening went around the table, and even Mr. Calvin joined in the laugh against himself. And now, while we are on the trusts, Ernest went on, let us settle a few things. I shall make certain statements, and if you disagree with them, speak up. Silence will mean agreement. Is it not true that a machine loom will weave more cloth and weave more cheaply than a hand loom? He paused, but nobody spoke up. Is it not then highly irrational to break the machine loom and go back to the clumsy, more costly hand loom method of weaving? Heads nodded in acquiescence. Is it not true that known as a trust produces more efficiently and cheaply than can 1,000 competing small concerns? Still no one objected. Then is it not irrational to destroy that cheap and efficient combination? No one answered for a long time. Then Mr. Kowalt spoke. What are we to do, then? He demanded. To destroy the trusts is the only way we can see to escape their domination. Ernest was all fire and aliveness on the instant. I'll show you another way, he cried. Let us not destroy those wonderful machines that produce efficiently and cheaply. Let us control them. Let us profit by their efficiency and cheapness. Let us run them for ourselves. Let us oust the present owners of the wonderful machines, and let us own the wonderful machines ourselves. That, gentlemen, is socialism, a greater combination than the trusts, a greater economic and social combination than any that has yet appeared on the planet. It is in line with evolution. We meet combination with greater combination. It is the winning side. Come on over with us, socialists, and play on the winning side. Here arose dissent. There was a shaking of heads, and mutterings arose. All right, then. You prefer to be anachronisms, Ernest laughed. You prefer to play atavistic roles. You are doomed to perish as all atavisms perish. Have you ever asked what will happen to you when greater combinations than even the present trusts arise? Have you ever considered where you will stand when the great trusts themselves combine into the combination of combinations, into the social, economic, and political trust? He turned abruptly and irrelevantly upon Mr. Calvin. Tell me, Ernest said, if this is not true. You are compelled to form a new political party because the old parties are in the hands of the trusts. The chief obstacle to your Grange propaganda is the trusts. Behind every obstacle you encounter, every blow that smites you, every defeat that you receive is the hand of the trusts. Is this not so? Tell me. Mr. Calvin sat in uncomfortable silence. "Go ahead," Ernest encouraged. "It is true," Mr. Calvin confessed. "We captured the state legislature of Oregon and put through splendid protective legislation, and it was vetoed by the governor, who was a creature of the trusts. We elected a governor of Colorado, and the legislature refused to permit him to take office. Twice we have passed a national income tax, and each time the Supreme Court smashed it as unconstitutional. The courts are in the hands of the trusts. We, the people, do not pay our judges sufficiently. But there will come a time when the combination of the trusts will control all legislation, when the combination of the trusts will itself be the government," Ernest interrupted. "Never! Never!" were the cries that arose. Everybody was excited and belligerent. "Tell me," Ernest demanded, "what will you do when such a time comes?" "We will rise in our strength," Mr. Asmundsen cried, and many voices backed his decision. "That will be civil war," Ernest warned them. "So be it. Civil war," was Mr. Asmundsen's answer, with the cries of all the men at the table behind him. "We have not forgotten the deeds of our forefathers. For our liberties we are ready to fight and die." Ernest smiled. "Do not forget," he said, "that we had tacitly agreed that liberty in your case, gentlemen, means liberty to squeeze profits out of others." The table was angry now, fighting angry, but Ernest controlled the tumult and made himself heard. "One more question. When you rise in your strength, remember, the reason for your rising will be that the government is in the hands of the trusts. Therefore, against your strength, the government will turn the regular army, the navy, the militia, the police, in short, the whole organized war machinery of the United States. Where will your strength be then?" Dismay sat on their faces, and before they could recover, Ernest struck again. "Do you remember not so long ago when our regular army was only 50,000? Year by year it has been increased until today it is 300,000. Again he struck. "Nor is that all. While you diligently pursued that favorite phantom of yours called profits and moralized about that favorite fetish of yours called competition, even greater and more direful things have been accomplished by combination. There is the militia." "It is our strength," cried Mr. Cold. "With it we would repel the invasion of the regular army." "You would go into the militia yourself," was Ernest's retort, "and be sent to Maine, or Florida, or the Philippines, or anywhere else, to drown in blood your own comrades civil warring for their liberties. While from Kansas, or Wisconsin, or any other state, your own comrades would go into the militia and come here to California to drown in blood your own civil warring." Now they were really shocked, and they sat wordless, until Mr. Owen murmured, "We would not go into the militia. That would settle it. We would not be so foolish." Ernest laughed outright. "You do not understand the combination that has been effected. You could not help yourself. You would be drafted into the militia." "There is such a thing as civil law," Mr. Owen insisted. "Not when the government suspends civil law. In that day when you speak of rising in your strength would be turned against yourself. Into the militia you would go, willy-nilly. Habeas corpus, I heard someone mutter just now. Instead of habeas corpus, you would get post-mortems. If you refused to go into the militia or to obey after you were in, you would be tried by drumhead court-martial and shot down like dogs. It's the law." "It is not the law," Mr. Calvin asserted positively. "There is no such law. Young man, you have dreamed all this. Why, you spoke of sending the militia to the Philippines. That is unconstitutional. The Constitution especially states that the militia cannot be sent out of the country." "What's the Constitution got to do with it?" Ernest demanded. "The courts interpret the Constitution, and the courts, as Mr. Asmundsen agreed, are the creatures of the trusts. Besides, it is, as I have said, the law. It has been the law for years, for 9 years, gentlemen." "That we can be drafted into the militia?" Mr. Calvin asked incredulously. "That they can shoot us by drumhead court-martial if we refuse?" "Yes," Ernest answered. "Precisely that." "How is it that we have never heard of this law?" my father asked, and I could see that it was likewise new to him. "For 2 reasons," Ernest said. "First, there has been no need to enforce it. If there had, you'd have heard of it soon enough. And secondly, The law was rushed through Congress and the Senate secretly, with practically no discussion. Of course, the newspapers made no mention of it, but we socialists knew about it. We published it in our papers, but you never read our papers. "I still insist you are dreaming," Mr. Calvin said stubbornly. "The country would never have permitted this." "But the country did permit it," Ernest replied. "And as for my dreaming," he put his hand in his pocket and drew out a small pamphlet. "Tell me if this looks like dream stuff." He opened it and began to read. Section 1. Be it enacted, and so forth, that the militia shall consist of every able-bodied male citizen of the respective states, territories, and District of Columbia, who is more than 18 and less than 45 years of age. Section 7. That any officer or enlisted man, remember Section 1, gentlemen, you are all enlisted men, that any enlisted man of the militia who shall refuse or neglect to present himself to such mustering officer upon being called forth as herein prescribed, shall be subject to trial by court-martial and shall be punished as such court-martial shall direct. Section 8. That courts-martial for the trial of officers or men of the militia shall be composed of militia officers only. Section 9. That the militia, when called into the actual service of the United States, shall be subject to the same rules and articles of war as the regular troops of the United States. There you are, gentlemen, American citizens, and fellow militiamen. 9 years ago, we socialists thought that law was aimed against labor, but it would seem that it was aimed against you, too. Congressman Wiley, in the brief discussion that was permitted, said that the bill provided for a reserve force to take the mob by the throat. You're the mob, gentlemen, and protect at all hazards life, liberty, and property. And in the time to come, when you rise in your strength, remember that you will be rising against the property of the trusts and the liberty of the trusts according to the law to squeeze you. Your teeth are pulled, gentlemen. Your claws are trimmed. In the day you rise in your strength, toothless and clawless, you will be as harmless as any army of clams. "I don't believe it," Cowald cried. "There is no such law. It is a canard got up by you socialists." "This bill was introduced in the House of Representatives on July the 30th, 1902, was the reply. "It was introduced by Representative Dick of Ohio. It was rushed through. It was passed unanimously by the Senate on January the 14th, 1903, and just 7 days afterward was approved by the President of the United States." Note: Everhard was right in the essential particulars, though his date of the introduction of the bill is in error. The bill was introduced on June the 30th and not on July the 30th. The congressional record is here in Ardis, and a reference to it shows mention of the bill on the following dates: June the 30th, December 9th, 15th, 16th, and 17th, 1902, and January 7th and 14th, 1903. The ignorance evidenced by the businessmen at the dinner was nothing unusual. Very few people knew of the existence of this law. E. Unterman, a revolutionist, in July 1903, published a pamphlet at Girard, Kansas, on the militia bill. This pamphlet had a small circulation among working men, but already had the segregation of classes proceeded so far that the members of the middle class never heard of the pamphlet at all, and so remained in ignorance of the law.